Hello there, and welcome to the next part of the Godot platformer. In this video, we are going to finish up the bullets, and that is going to mean a couple of things. Number one, we have a gun the player can actually pick up. Number two is going to be a fire animation, so it looks a bit better when we are shooting the bullet. After that, we're going to create the basic outline of the bee and of the worm, so we have actual targets to hit. That should advance the game quite a bit. Let's jump right in. Here we are in the Godot editor, and I want to start with a gun pickup. For that, I will create a new scene, which has to be an area 2D. I suppose we can rename this right away to gun. If I now save the scene under scenes, gun.tscn looks good. And now we have a gun scene. And to this scene, we are going to add two things, a sprite 2D and a collision shape 2D. For the graphic, I want to go to player, gun, and in there we have gun.png. This is going to be our texture. After that, we need to set a collision shape. And for this one, I will go with a rectangle shape and make it so that it fits the gun more or less. This collision doesn't have to be perfect, but I think this looks alright. Now that we have that, inside of the level, I want to add one instance of this gun. And while we are doing that, I want to move the bee a bit to the side. And first of all, I want to add another node 2D with all of my guns. I always want to keep the scene tree nice and organized. After that, we can add gun.tscn, which is going to be added in the origin point, but I want to move it right next to the player. I can now run the game, and we have a gun in the game. That looks good. Although I want it to look just a bit better. For that, with the gun selected, I'm going to add a script. Gun.gd is totally fine. Inside of the script, I want to run func_process and use that function to move the gun up and down. At the moment, we have the gun simply floating somewhere in the air, but I want this thing to go up and down and always float like this. Although that should only happen on the vertical axis. I do not want it to move left or right. As a consequence, I only want to target position.y. And to that, I want to add the sign value of the current time in the game. So time.get ticks in milliseconds. What that is going to do, if I run the script, it's going to look a bit weird. So now the gun is jittering. That is because this value is updating way too fast. One thing we can already do is to multiply all of this with delta. That way, it might not work at all, or at least not do anything. So if you look very closely, you can see some minor jitters. Hence, with delta applied, this value is getting way too small. But that we can fix by adding another multiplier, let's say 10, and then we should see something. And that starts to look a bit better, at least we have movement. The issue now is that we are applying this sign value way too often, or this time is too fast. For that, I want to divide it by 200. And now if I run all of this again, we get a much nicer behavior. So that is what I actually like. When you're using the sign function, you are getting a sign value, something like this, with the highest value being a 1 and the lowest value being a -1. And we simply move from one to the other, depending on what our time is. So if this was a coordinate system, time would be our x-axis, and our y-axis would be the sign value. Hence, this sign value is going to add or subtract values, but we will always float around that point. Via the other two numbers, so to divide 200 and multiply by 10, we are controlling the speed of it. And delta time, we need to control for the frame rate independence. That's all that's happening in here. And I think if I run all of this again, this kind of movement looks much better. But it doesn't make the gun actually function. For that, with the gun selected, I want to go to node and then look at body entered. Connect this signal to the script, and now we have an onBody entered function. The player will always be the body inside of this function. Meaning whenever I write body, I am talking about the player. And if the player collects a gun, I want to set has gun to true. And that should actually already work, although to test it, inside of the player, when the game is starting, has gun should be false. Now let's try all of that, and by default the player doesn't have a gun. But once I collide with the gun, we have a gun. And we can shoot again, so that is looking pretty good. On top of that, after the player has collided with the gun, I want to destroy it, which I'm doing with Q3. Now that we have that, in the game, once the player collides with the gun, we have the gun animation, we can shoot, and the gun has disappeared. So that looks really good. So at this point, we have a much nicer level. And later on, when we are building the actual level, we can create a whole bunch more guns. But for now, one is totally fine. First of all, though, we have another issue, and that is at the moment, any kind of object in the game could theoretically collide with the gun. And since only the player has gun, if we were to run this line, we would get an error. So for example, if the bee tried to collide with the gun, then we would have a problem. As a consequence, I want to update the collision behavior. That means, let's start in the player actually. When you open the player and you go to Inspector and look at collisions, we have every single object on collision layer 1 and on collision mask 1. So everything can see everything else, and that's just simply not good. To fix that, I want to go to Project, Project Settings, and if I scroll down just a bit, there we have 2D Physics. And I want to create a couple of custom layers. Let's start with number 1, the terrain. Then we want to have the player, then the enemies, the items, and finally the bullets. Now I can close this dialog and then update all of the collidable sprites. First of all, for the player. I want the player to be on layer 2. And the player can see all of the terrain. The player shouldn't see itself. The player should be seeing the enemies and the items, but the player should not be seeing the bullets. Next up, I want to work on the bee, and in there we have collisions. The bee should be on the enemies layer, so layer number 3. It should be able to see the terrain. On top of that, it should see the player, but it should not see other enemies. It also shouldn't see the items, but it should see the other bullets. That way we can actually hit it. Next up, the bullet. For this one in the collisions, we want to be on the bullet layer, and it should only see the enemies. Finally, we have the gun. And for the gun, I want to have collisions that this object is on the items layer, so layer number 4, and it can only see the player. And I think I should have done a recap. Every collision object has a layer and a mask. The layer determines on which layer the collision object is, whereas the mask determines what layers this object can see. I think if I go to the player, it's most easily described. The player currently lives on layer 2. And the player can see the terrain objects, he can see the enemies, and he can see the items. However, the player cannot see the bullet layer. That's layer 5. And because of that, none of the bullets can actually collide with the player. Once again, if that sounds confusing, just check out the introduction to Godot. It's a really important thing to understand. Although at the moment, in practice, it shouldn't make any kind of noticeable difference. So the game still works just as before. That looks alright. I suppose next up, we can start working on hitting the enemies. First of all, we have a bee for that. For this bee, and with the Area 2D node selected, I want to go to the node signals and then check for area entered. Double click on that, and we cannot at the moment connect it to the bee because the bee does not have a script. That we can change quite easily, bee.gd, and now with Area 2D selected, area entered, and connect. If that is going to happen, I simply want to print bee was hit. Let's try that. If I now shoot at the bee, we are getting bee was hit. So that works really well. Now what we can also do, since we know that this area has to be a laser, simply because with the bee selected via the collision layers, the only layer that this Area 2D for the bee can see is the terrain, which is not going to be an Area 2D, Then we have the player, also not an area 2D. And finally, we have the bullets. And out of all of those layers, only the bullets are areas, meaning this area is always going to be a bullet. Which means we can set area.q3, and after that, whenever we hit the B with a bullet, the bullet disappears. And that looks pretty good. Cool. So with that system, we have a pretty good start with the bullet mechanics. There are just two more things that I want to cover. If the player is shooting a bullet, I want to have a fire animation, or not really an animation, more like a fire image to indicate that we have shot. And this should be either on the right side or on the left side. Besides that, we're going to add one more enemy, and that will be the worm. Also, we have two debugger issues. I want to fix those as well. I want to start with the fire animations, and that's going to happen inside of the player. To make that work, I want to add another node to D that I will rename right away to fire. In there, I want to add two sprite 2Ds. I guess we can rename them right away. Fire left, then duplicate this and rename it to fire right. Also, the order for these nodes is really important. I'll explain that later on, but the left fire has to come first. As a matter of fact, let's attach the textures right away. I believe they are inside of bullet. There we have fire.png. This I want to add to the texture for both of those. Fire right should be on the right side and fire left should be on the left side. And this one should also have flip H activated. And now, if you look very closely, you have to make sure that you are aligning all of this with the pixel art. If you can't align this perfectly, you can go to transform, and for the position, right now 11 is a bit too far and 10 is a bit too short. So we want 10.5. Besides that, on animated sprite 2D, you want to activate flip H and then place the other fire animation. And for this one, once again, transform negative 10.5. Cool, so now we have a fire animation. The issue is, if I run the game, both of those are always going to be visible, which looks a bit funny. Hence, by default, both of those are going to be invisible. And then, when we are shooting a bullet, which is going to happen inside of get input, and I want to maximize all of this. We know inside of this if statement if the player is shooting a bullet. Meaning in there, we want to get the fire nodes, although I want to get one particular child via the index. If you use a node with children and the getChild method, then you can place an index inside of this node. For example, 0 in our case would be the first node, fire left, and 1 would be the second one, fire right. For now, I am going to stick with a 1 in here, just to test things. But after we have that, I simply want to show that particular sprite. Let's try all of that in the game, and if I have the gun and shoot to the right, we have the fire animation. Although, I suppose it's not really an animation, it's more like a simple sprite. Basically, after we are creating this, we want to hide all of the sprite after a very short amount of time again. For that, I will add another timer. Meaning with timer selected, I want to add another timer node, which I'm going to call the fire timer. The duration for this one is going to be 0.1, and this one has to be a one-shot. Once the player has shot a bullet, we want to activate the cooldown timer, and we want to activate timers and the fire timer. After that, once the fire timer times out, I want to connect the signal to the player script. And then simply hide all of the children inside of the fire node. That we can do very easily. Let's call it for child in fire.getChildren. That way, we're getting all of the child nodes inside of fire, and we simply want to child.hide. With that system, if I run the game, we can pick up a gun, and if I shoot, we get the fire bit just for a very short amount of time, which I think looks significantly better. However, the issue now, if we are looking to the left, it's on the wrong side. That is very easily fixable though. At the moment, when we are getting the children, we always get index 1, which would be fire right. If this was a 0, we would always get the left one. So with there, we always have a left fire. Meaning now we have to figure out from one of our variables how to set this number dynamically to a 0 or a 1. And that variable we already have. It's called facing right, which is a Boolean value. So this one is either true or false. And to make that work efficiently, we can use int and then facing right. And that should actually be it. If I run the game again and I shoot to the right or the left, we get the proper system. So that is working really well. And I think I should explain. Facing right is a Boolean value, meaning it could either be true or it could be false. These are the only two options. And if we pass that into the end function, true is going to become a 1 and false is going to become a 0. And that number is what we're using for the indexing, meaning 0 would be fire left and 1 would be fire right. Because of that, the order of fire left and fire right is really important. Fire left has to be the first child, because this one we are accessing via the index 0. Also, I realized that we don't actually need this integer. If you remove it and simply pass in facing right, you can run all of this again and shoot the gun. It works totally fine. So Godot automatically converts the data type, which is super handy. And while we are here, I realized there's one thing missing. The player should only be able to shoot the gun if we are pressing the shoot button, if can shoot is activated, and if the player has a gun in the first place. If we don't include that and I run the game, I can simply press space without having a gun and we can still shoot, which looks a bit silly. Which means and has gun needs to be there. After that, before we continue, I want to fix the debugger issues. They shouldn't be too big. First of all, we are never using the parameter delta in some function. Let's click on that. And this is inside of the player. We are never using this delta. That is because move and slide automatically applies it. So we don't have to do it manually. What Godot wants here is an underscore if we are not using this parameter. If I now run the game again, we only have a single debugger issue. That feels nicer. Let's work on that one. We have an integer division, decimal part will be discarded. And that happens inside of this division. The way we are going to fix that is with 200.0. I can now run this again, and no more debugger issues. That always feels cleaner. Cool. That just leaves one issue to deal with, and that's going to be your exercise. I want you guys to create the worm enemy. For this one, you need to add a graphic and a collision area, very similar compared to the bee. On top of that, assign the worm to the right collision layer and mask. And finally, make the worm hittable with the bullets. All of this should look very similar compared to what we have done with the bee. Pause the video now and see how far you get. First of all, we will need a new scene, which has to be an area 2D node. Let's rename that one to worm right away. And then we can add a sprite 2D and a collision shape 2D. For the sprite 2D texture, I want to look at the enemies, and in there we have a worm. For now, I want to use one.png and drag this one into the sprite texture. Then we can see this enemy, it's really small. And after that, we can create a collision shape. I think the best one for this would be a capsule shape, although we have to rotate it by 90 degrees, like so. Then I can make it a bit smaller and make the worm fit it like so. In case you are worried, this little gap at the bottom is not too important. Later on, the only movement that the worm can do is left or right. There's no gravity or any kind of downwards or upwards movement for this object. So as long as we are placing it in the right position, we don't have to worry about anything else. But we'll cover that in the next video. First of all, I want to save this as worm.tscn. Next up, with the area 2D selected, I want to go to collisions and then assign the right layer and the right mask. Layer 1 is just for the terrain. I want the worm to be on layer number 3. After that, the worm should only really see the bullets and the player. That's a really good start. Next up, inside of the level, with the enemy selected, I want to press Ctrl, Shift, and A, and then add a worm scene to the level. This is once again in the origin point, so let me drag it to the right position. Let's say here. And for that, once again, at the moment, we have either a bit of a gap or a bit of an overlap with the terrain, which I really don't like. To fix that, inside of transform, you simply have to add a 0.5 to position.y. And then you have a pixel perfect connection. Let's try all of this, and we have a worm, although at the moment, it doesn't really do anything. For that, inside of the worm, I want to add a script. Worm.gd is totally fine. And now, with the area 2D node selected, I want to go to node and then area entered and connect it to the script. This is actually going to be basically identical compared to what we have done in the B, at least for now. So inside of the worm, we want to pass in print B was hit. I guess this one could be worm was hit. And then we want to get rid of the laser. Once again, this area 2D here is always going to be a laser. This is the only area that can collide with this particular enemy. If I now shoot the worm, we get worm was hit, and if I shoot at the B, we get B was hit. So that is working really well. That covers another really important part. Next up, we can work on the damage mechanics.